Welcome back to the office at Whitetail Ridge, and today we're going to be talking about starting a homestead from scratch. These are just some of the things that I would do because, I've made mistakes, and if I can help anyone learn from those, I would be very pleased in offering that assistance. But one of the most important things that you need to do when you first go into homesteading is you need to take into account, we're going to assume that you already have land or that you're close to acquiring land. And when you do that, you want to immediately get out and start exploring that land. Get out there and really get a feel for what's going on. When you're doing that, you need to go ahead and establish boundaries. Find out where your property pins and property lines are. And if in the process, you can just so manage to bump into one of the neighbors, if you have neighbors, and have them assist you with that, therefore developing somewhat of a relationship off the start with those people, it wouldn't hurt anything at all. When we first moved out here, we actually jumped right straight into it, not thinking much of anything other than, oh, this is a general area of where our property lines are, and we rented an excavator and started digging because we were originally going to build an earthship home. And as luck would have it, we got about halfway into that dig and we're like, man, you know what, we might want to go out and check and just make certain that we're not going the wrong direction or cutting across any lines. And as luck would have it, we were about 20 feet in the wrong direction and over on to the neighbor. It took us about a year to actually catch up with this person before we could actually explain what happened. And thankfully enough for us, the guy was from upstate New York, and he doesn't spend a lot of time down here, and he doesn't have anything set up. But when he showed up, we explained the situation, how we had cut a couple of trees and we offered to replace those trees. And at the same time, he said, no harm, no foul. You actually cut into where I was planning on putting a driveway anyway. So as far as I'm concerned, you did me a favor. Don't worry about it. So you know what, near miss on that one. But I cannot stress how important it is to get out and just double check your lines, make sure the pins are there, and try to establish a relationship with those neighbors if at all possible. Because upon further searching, we actually discovered that our pins weren't even actually in place. We had to call the land management company and have them come back out and set the pins. So again, right there, it was our fault, but at the same time, wasn't our fault. Either way, long story short, is we got lucky on that. Find your pins, find your lines, establish those lines, and do what you can to establish a relationship with the neighbors. Now, the particular order of these events could be taken into question by everyone, but this is the route that I would go. Number 2 thing I would do on this list is establish a very good water source. Now, whether that be a water source like what I have right next to me right now is one thing. This is a wet weather creek, and typically throughout the year, at any given point in time, as long as we're getting rain within the past 2 weeks, this will be at least trickling the way that it is now. And it gets even more plentiful the further down in this bottom I go. If I go another 200 feet down, I have ponds, small ponds and pools of water down there that I can take from for animals or for our consumption or anything if need be. But in doing that, you need to make sure that you have a water source. So either this, rainwater, or well. We are currently working on getting a well, but the water source is one of the most important things that you're going to have on the property. It's going to sustain life for you and for the animals. So in my opinion, that needs to be your step number 2. And kind of piggybacking off of that, looking at your property when you're exploring it, you need to make sure that you're finding good flat areas for whatever future purpose they may serve. And that kind of goes in with the well. You want to have somewhere that well is going to be set up, so when you go into putting a house in, you're not going a mile this way or a mile that way in order to try and get the thing hooked up. So getting a well put in place first, in my opinion, is probably the smartest move. Then moving on to the third step, this is where I would actually go into setting up your quote unquote base camp or your home for the stead. So that way you can position it around the well and some of your flat areas that you may have already figured out, or maybe you want to build on a hillside. Doesn't really matter what you're doing, but you can position that around the well to get it to have the most functionality, if you will. You don't want to be stretching water lines here, there, and wherever and end up finding out you can't trench through here because you got bedrock or something to that extent. So the house and actual living quarters or base camp, whatever you want to call it, would be my step number 3. And no, we did not do these in this order by any means. That's why I'm telling you, learn from our mistakes. We're still trying to get the well. So after you get your house area set up, this is where you're going to want to move into step number 4, and that's actually acquiring your food supplies and just supplies in general, and also nailing down some kind of a power source. So if you want to break that down into a few different items, that's one thing. But this is where you move in and actually start getting your tooling, getting your equipment. You know, you got to have saws and everything because you're obviously going to be making trails and paths and stuff to put up for animal pens later on. So acquiring all of your like food, canned goods, stuff like that, tools, this is the time to do it. Everyone wants to just rush right in and start getting animals and everything, and that is the worst thing to do. You need to get good infrastructure built up before you do anything along those lines. Now, moving into the next step-ish in this particular area, because you're going to need power and backup power and all kinds of everything in that realm, but it all kind of lumps together into the home. And you need to decide if you're going to be on grid power, which we are not. So for the sake of this video, we're just going to say solar power or generator, something to that extent. So we have our solar set up and it's relatively close to the house. This is where you need to start making a decision along those lines. You need to figure out exactly your power requirements that you're going to be needing. We run a typical household. We're more on the minimalist side. We do have computers and phones and phone chargers and a refrigerator and a deep freeze and all the chargers for the battery tools and whatnot. But for the most part, we keep it pretty low end, so we don't need a lot of power. But again, this is where you're going to want to get a power source put into place. And having a backup generator is always a plus. Moving on to the next area, if you're going to get any animals at this time, once you've secured a water source and a living area for yourself, the only animal that I would really recommend getting early on would be chickens or some kind of fowl that can free range without a lot of extra feed or even housing. But you would want to get some kind of housing put for the chickens so that way they can roost up. At a very minimum, get a cheap carport or something, or a cheap greenhouse, so that way they have somewhere to escape to from weather and whatnot. And the reason why I say get chickens or some kind of fowl that can run around is because, excuse me, here in the Ozarks, at least for us, ticks are a huge issue. Bugs in general are a huge issue, but ticks can get absolutely horrible. And the chickens will absolutely have a heyday with them, and they will get good and fattened up off of those ticks and start laying eggs, or even, you know, getting ready for harvest. So that way you can eat them. But I personally would recommend that as a first animal to get started, especially if you have a big bug population, because they are going to help make your life so much easier. I don't know if you've sat around for hours or not picking ticks off you, but it is a real pain. So that would be the first animal that I would get. Moving on into anything else on the property, really, this is where you're going to start doing a layout, a very detailed layout of animal pens, whether you're going to get goats or cows or more chickens or turkeys or ducks, whatever it may be. This is where you kind of really start to break away from the mold, if you will, and just kind of freestyle it and start getting what you actually want, why you decided to start a homestead from scratch, and just start having your blank canvas and working with it. But I would not do that until you have all of the aforementioned things squared away and 100% working, because if you don't, you are going to just figure out that life is very difficult. One of the mistakes that we made right off the bat was, again, this is my fault because I was just so thrilled to get out here and get started. It was, we didn't find our property lines. We went over a line. We did get a tiny house cabin that we bought, was pre-manufactured, and get it brought out, which was not our plan. But we started getting put into position where we had to force moves at that point because we jumped the gun early on. So we did get a prefab tiny home brought out here, little shed cabin thing. And, you know, it works, and it works for us, and we're probably going to end up keeping it, but we wanted to build something else. But the biggest problem was that we actually started acquiring animals because they came in at a good price at the right time for us. And we immediately got pigs, and then we immediately figured out that we had no valid water source, because we thought, oh, rainwater, it'll be just fine. We'll just collect rainwater from the gutters. And our first year out here, we had, I'm telling you, it was nearly 100% drought summer. I think we got rain one time in the early spring, and we got rain one time in the early fall, and then obviously winter got carried away. But we had animals on hand that didn't have water, and we were having to beg, borrow, truck water in from the campground that's 15 miles away, and it was a freaking pain. So don't make that mistake and go out and start getting animals, because you are going to hate life, and who knows, you may just quit doing it altogether. So make sure you have an established water source before those animals move in. Aside from that, it's really just do what you want and have fun. Just make sure that you're smart about the stupid things that you do, as they would tell us in the Army. And really, I mean, from there, life should just get a little bit easier each day with every project that you do. And I mean, inevitably, something's going to go wrong. But if you take those early on steps and take those safeguards, safe measures, and get those things put into place first, you should have a fairly smooth sailing start into the homestead life. And one other add-on is that, in my opinion, for anyone that's watching this that may be of the younger variety than myself, if you know this is a lifestyle that you want to get into and something that you're going to stick with, start sooner rather than later. Don't accumulate a bunch of debt, and just get into it and go at it when you're young and start building slow, because you do not want to have one of these big fancy homesteads that you see on the internet in any place, where you can tell they just threw money at it. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Some people can do that, but accumulating and acquiring that much debt just to have what you want, I mean, yeah, it makes sense to a point, But at the same time, you don't want to be slaving away and working your life away for something that you never spend time at. So keep those points in mind when doing this. Either way, that's my 2 cents. Thanks for watching, and I hope some of this helps you. Have an amazing evening, everyone.